Hello, welcome to Non-Toxic Land Management for New York City Parks. This is an educational webinar for New York City Parks managers to implement a law passed by the New York City Council on Earth Day 2021 to transition our parks to organic land management. I'm Jay Feldman, Executive Director of Beyond Pesticides, a coalition partner of Eco-Friendly Parks for All, which brings together New York City residents and organizations, medical practitioners, environmental groups, labor groups, and land managers to advance safe parks for people, including children, of course, pets, landscapers, and the environment. I'd like to share my screen now and offer a little orientation on how we got to where we are with this law in New York City. So let me start by saying that we have experience and have seen across the United States beautiful landscapes without toxic chemicals. And that's why we're here today. As I mentioned, I'm with an organization called Beyond Pesticides. We're a national group. We work closely with organizations in New York City to advance organic land management. The webinar today is being convened by Eco-Friendly Parks, which I mentioned earlier, and specifically co-sponsored by a range of organizations and people, including the Battery Park Conservancy and Brooklyn Bridge Park, which has experience in actually implementing organic land management, the Black Institute and Grassroots Environmental Education, New York City Council members, and et cetera. The context. Well, New York City passed a law back in 2005 called Local Law 37, and we are simply modernizing this statute. That law really restricted specific pesticides that were linked to cancer and other chronic effects. Intro 1524, the law passed on Earth Day 2021, hones in on allowable materials. It effectively modernizes the law that was passed back in 2005 by identifying the national list of allowed and prohibited substances, which is a federal list of allowed substances in organic land management. The context for this is a survey that was done back in 2018, which identified 284,000 applications of pesticides in New York City. That's 156,000 pounds of pesticides. So we're trying to transition, and we are transitioning away from that dependency on toxic chemicals. The context of that are a range of adverse health effects and environmental effects. And part of what we're learning from COVID is that we have among the residents of New York City and across the country, people with pre-existing conditions, may have cancer, may have reproductive problems, may have neurological problems, respiratory problems, and pesticides exacerbate those conditions. So if we can eliminate those chemicals and still have beautiful lawns and playable playing fields and so forth, why not do that? Same thing with the environmental effects. Why not protect our waterways, groundwater and surface waters, protect birds, protect fish and aquatic life, and protect bees? This is what we can do by eliminating herbicides that have adverse impact on habitats, milkweed for monarch butterflies, but other habitats as well, and systemic chemicals that have non-target impacts on bees and pollinators, birds, as mentioned earlier. So what do? We change our focus. We begin thinking about working with nature. And in this realm, we talk about ecosystem services. What does nature provide for us in terms of plant health, resiliency, water retention that we don't get when we use chemicals? Our focus, and we'll be learning about this today in the webinar, is focusing on healthy soil. Healthy soil, teeming with life, microbial life, soil biology. How do we enhance and nurture that soil biology? Because when we do that, we cycle nutrients. We literally use and work with nature to cycle nutrients for the plants. We do this by strengthening the soil food web. That's the complex world of soil-dwelling organisms that contribute to the cycling of nutrients. Beyond that, in New York City with this statute, we're really looking holistically at the impact that we have across the board. And this chart on the right, you can see the leaves of the graph are longer, and that suggests that we're getting more return from an organic system than we get from a chemical system. What does that mean? Well, that means we're minimizing energy use. That means we're enhancing biodiversity, getting that cycling of nutrients, producing nitrogen rather than buying nitrogen. We're minimizing water pollution. We're reducing total costs over time because fertilizers are expensive, synthetic fertilizers. We are protecting workers, and we're minimizing pesticide exposure. Now, this chart was developed for agriculture. So you see in the realm of agriculture, and this can be true for our community gardens, we're increasing nutritional quality and we're seeing better yields over time. The result on a playing field is a beautiful playing field that has tremendous resiliency, is highly playable, even more playable, less weeds to manage because we're preventing weeds, and as I said, greater water retention. So with that, let me shift to our other speakers today. We have a really good lineup of folks. But before I do that, I wanted to mention one of our key partners, the Black Institute, could not be here today. Bertha Lewis, the president of the Black Institute, has been instrumental in advancing the law in New York City to transition to organic, having written a report called Poison Parks, in which the Black Institute identified disproportionate risk in the city to people of color communities, with elevated risk factors in people of color communities and actually elevated rates of exposure to pesticides in the parks in those communities, and found in Harlem and Queens elevated use patterns of pesticides. And when I say pesticides, I'm talking about insecticides and weed killers, herbicides. In addition, Poison Parks identified that landscapers in New York City are majority people of color. So we are having a disproportionate impact on African Americans, Latinx community, as a result of our continued dependence on pesticides. Our next speaker today will be Dr. Sarah Evans. Dr. Evans is Assistant Professor of Environmental Medicine and Public Health at the Exposomic Research Institute at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. Dr. Evans has given much of her time to local community organizations that are seeking to understand the real impact of pesticides on public health in particular. And she has brought her expertise not only to New York City, but to communities across the country. And with that, let me introduce Dr. Sarah Evans.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction, Jay. And as Jay mentioned, I am an assistant professor in environmental medicine and public health at Mount Sinai in New York City. At Mount Sinai, I'm part of a team of scientists and pediatricians who have special training in environmental health, and we study and treat diseases of environmental origins. And so I'm just going to speak for a few minutes about why we at Mount Sinai strongly supported the passage and now the implementation of this law to protect the health of all New Yorkers. So it likely doesn't come as a surprise to all of you that chronic diseases, both of childhood and of aging, are on the rise. So that today, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 2 men will develop cancer in their lifetime. We're seeing 1 in 6 children with a developmental disability or a learning disability. And just last week, the CDC released new data showing an increase in autism rates to 1 in 44 by the time that a child is 8 years old. So our work at Mount Sinai is really aimed at uncovering the underlying causes of this increase in chronic diseases, which really can't be explained by genetics alone. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the evidence as to why we think that pesticides are one contributor to rates of chronic illness. And so first, we know that pesticides are present in the body of all Americans. So the CDC conducts studies that show over 200 synthetic chemicals in the blood and urine of all Americans. And we know that many of these exposures, including pesticides, are higher in children, higher in Black and Hispanic participants. And so we're very concerned about what these chronic, long-term, and low-dose additive chemical exposures are doing to our health. And so one of the major reasons that my colleagues and I supported this law is because children are particularly vulnerable to pesticide exposures through their play in New York City parks. And so this is because obviously they roll around in the grass, they're closer to the ground, they put their hands and other objects in their mouths, and they breathe faster than adults. So they're more likely to inhale chemicals that are present in the air. And not only are they exposed to higher levels of pesticides, but their developing organs are more sensitive to these types of exposures. And then in addition to children, we know that people who apply pesticides are at very high risk. And most of what we know about the health impacts of pesticide exposure come from studies like the Agricultural Health Study, which is a study of over 50,000 pesticide applicators in the United States, as well as their families. And these are individuals who have been studied for going on 30 years now, and numerous health impacts of exposure to pesticides have been seen in those populations. And you've likely also heard recent stories of individuals like Dwayne Johnson, a groundskeeper from California, who developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma after using glyphosate-based herbicides, and was actually subsequently won a lawsuit against the company. And so this perception that if these chemicals are available to consumers, they must be safe, really is unfortunately false. So if we look at the top pesticides that are applied throughout this country on the order of over 1 billion pounds each year, we can see that these are all associated with harm to the brain, increased risk of cancer, and hormone disruption. And that's not all. So studies like the Agricultural Health Study, as well as studies that follow women who are exposed to pesticides during pregnancy or children who are exposed to pesticides early in their life, show that we see impacts on the brain, respiratory illness, hormone disruption and infertility, increased risk of cardiovascular disease, increased risk of certain cancers, as well as diabetes and obesity in individuals who experience chronic exposures to pesticides. In particular, when we look at insecticides, it's not surprising that we see interference with brain development and cognition and neurodegeneration. These chemicals are actually designed to be toxic to the nervous system of insects. And so we see that they act very similarly in the human body. And this is just a diagram showing two brain cells trying to communicate with each other and all the different ways that we know that common pesticides can interfere with that communication. And so then when we look at children who were exposed to pesticides in the womb or early in life, or farm workers who were exposed chronically to pesticides, we see things like decrease in IQ, increased behavioral problems, and neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's disease. And I mentioned cancer earlier, and so early life exposures to pesticides are also associated with a number of different blood, brain, and other types of cancers, both in children and in adults and farm workers. In particular, we're seeing a lot of increasing evidence for the impacts of glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup and one of the most commonly used pesticides in the country, and in parks to eliminate weeds. And glyphosate is actually classified by the World Health Organization as a probable human carcinogen, yet still widely applied and widely available. But numerous studies are confirming an increased risk of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, like the groundskeeper Dwayne Johnson and others developed after use of this chemical. And then lastly, I just wanted to touch on ingredients that are not the active ingredients in pesticides, but which can make up the majority of a pesticide formulation. And we have concerns about those as well. And we're finding that often the mixtures of these chemicals can cause more harm than the single active ingredient alone. So for all of these reasons, we as public health scientists at Mount Sinai see the implementation of pesticide restrictions across New York City as being a major step towards decreasing harmful exposures and protecting the health of New Yorkers. The good news is that we know that stronger regulations are the most effective strategy towards reducing these harmful exposures. And so we really applaud the steps that the city is taking to reduce harm. And so I'll just end there to let you know that you can contact us at the Children's Environmental Health Center at Mount Sinai, or you can find us on social media if you want more information about health impacts of pesticides or other environmental exposures. And so with that, I will turn it back to Jay.
Thank you, Sarah. And you know, your presentation really provides important context for why we're moving away from toxic chemical use in land management. A lot of this we've been working on this for a very long time, and one of the major organizations, both in the state and nationally, is Grassroots Environmental Education. Grassroots Environmental Education was founded by Patty and Doug Wood, and the purpose of the organization really is to educate the public about the links between common environmental exposures and human health, and to empower individuals to act as catalysts for change. And that's what, you know, you guys are on the ground. The folks that are implementing the law that was passed on Earth Day 1524 really is the change that is occurring nationwide. So we're really pleased to have Doug Wood, the Associate Director and co-founder of Grassroots Environmental Education, helping to spearhead the effort with the Black Institute and Mount Sinai to move this program along. So Doug, I'm going to turn this over to you, and then we're going to get right to the meat of the program, which is the technical information that will help us implement this law. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jay, so much. And thank you all for being here today. Our nonprofit has been focused on pesticides since our inception in the year 2000. We were the organization behind the New York State law that prohibits the use of toxic pesticides on school grounds in New York State. Still the best law in the country. We wish other states would follow, but they haven't yet. And when we passed that law, we heard a lot of people saying, oh, you know what, this is never going to work. Our fields are going to fail. And so we worked very closely with Chip Osborne on an education program for people in New York State, for facilities managers and groundskeepers, to understand the concepts of natural turf management. As you're about to hear from Chip, this is not about switching bag A for bag B. You can do that, of course, nobody can stop you, but you're really not going to get the best results or take advantage of everything that nature has given you to create beautiful looking turf and landscapes. Chip is the founder of Osborne Organics. He's a man who's been there and done that. We've worked with Chip for, I don't want to think how many years, but a lot of years. You know, and I've watched Chip work with landscapers and groundskeepers, and I'm always amazed that when there's a question, he's always got the answer because he's been there and done that. So he's going to give his presentation, and then we're going to open up the floor for the floor. I guess it's a floor. We'll open up the floor for your comments and questions. You know, you can put your questions in the chat as we go. And then I'll keep kind of track of them. And it's sometime around 12 o'clock, we should get to your questions. Then we're going to finish up by 12:30. So without further ado, I'm very happy to introduce to you, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chip Osborne.
Thank you very much, Doug. Well, thank you for the opportunity to, to be here today and talk a little bit about, how do we actually do this? And, what does this mean if we don't have those tools at our disposal, meaning, certain chemistries at our disposal to do things in land management? Where do we go from here? And am I expecting to have to lower my expectations? Does this mean that I'm going to have, a field or a park or some public space become inferior because I no longer have that at my disposal? I think working all these years with Doug and Patty, and then all these years with Jay, a lot of it has been finding solutions that work, the alternatives that work. And, I think we all agree that the discussion of synthetic pesticides, particularly in areas where children and the public play and congregate, is now a moot point because we do have alternatives that work. I've been a professional horticulturist for 50 years now. Half of my career, I was immersed in conventional management. I bought, sprayed, and mixed probably more pounds of active ingredient than most turf managers would in greenhouse and nursery production. 25 years ago, I shifted my horticultural specialty to turf and the landscape. And in that perspective was developing non-toxic approaches, because I felt I was simply on a pesticide treadmill, jumping from one product to another to try to do something. And, the end results always were not always that satisfactory. I'm also a 20-year elected official and the chairman of the Marblehead, Massachusetts Recreation and Park Commission for most of those 20 years. And have worked very closely developing and maintaining and managing municipal budgets. I have a consulting company, Osborne Organics, that works nationally in a hands-on way, teaching chemical-free strategies and strategies to ensure success. And that's really what we're after. When we embark on a transition to move from a synthetic approach to a more natural approach, our underlying goal is to improve the landscape. It's not simply just to maintain the status quo of what was given off to us, but it is to make it better and make it more resilient. So we're moving away from something, and then why? Well, Doug told you a little bit about and Jay a little bit about what we're moving away from, the synthetic chemistries. And Dr. Evans told us very, very completely why we're doing that. I don't think any of us just woke up this morning and decided that organic land management would be a great thing to do. A chemical-free approach would be a great thing. There are very specific reasons why we're doing this. So we're moving away from toxic pesticides, and we want to move beyond synthetic fertilizers. When we understand that most synthetic fertilizers are salt-based, and this law in place does not speak at all about synthetic fertilizers, but I guess the point is that if we continue to fertilize a turf system with salts, it's very hard to build that biological life that Jay talked about and to get that really working for us. So simultaneously to moving away from toxic pesticides, we're beginning to think about other methods of fertility. We're looking to protect human health and the environment. We're looking to reduce product input over time. And that's a big part of the alternative approach. When we're managing conventionally, we're basically doing the same thing year after year. Whatever the budget can afford, we're putting that much nitrogen out there and doing the same every year. When we move to a natural program, we know in the beginning that by the time we get to the 3-year point, we should be able to reduce product input. In other words, don't put as much fertilizer down there and maintain the same expectations, because we now have that hidden community under the ground working for us. So that really is a big part of all of this. We're looking to produce healthier landscapes, turf and soil. Notice I grouped that all together. The landscape, the turf, and the soil is all part of one system that now deserves our focus and our attention. And we're looking to reduce the carbon footprint of conventional land management because all of these are petrochemical products. And when we move to more natural products, we take that off the equation. So what is that? You've heard words: natural, organic, sustainable, regenerative, all these words that talk about something when we choose not to use synthetics. So we're adopting a systems-based approach, and this is really the foundation and critically the most important. We're adopting a systems-based approach, and we're abandoning a product approach. A lot of conventional management is presented by the calendar date with certain products, and we just go from there. systems approach to natural turf management, three basic concepts: strong focus on the soil biomass, proper horticultural practices, and the use of organic compatible products. So we are not talking about organic by neglect. We're not going to just sit back and do nothing. To me, a chemical-free approach or a natural approach is a thoughtful, proactive approach to management. So first and foremost, we have to understand that we need to bring these three concepts together to develop a successful management program. Then we look at chemical versus natural from a regulatory viewpoint. Some conventional products used in turfgrass management may or may not be approved or completely tested by a regulatory body. A lot of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers fall into that category. Within natural land management industry, we have producers, products, suppliers of materials that can be used to develop successful programs. Many of those products have a certification from the Organic Materials Review Institute, OMRI. Some don't, but they would be considered to be OMRI or organic compatible. So this means that materials have been put under some type of scrutiny to make sure that they are compatible with organic programs. Natural land management, how do we do it? What is it? So it is systems-based, as I've just told you. We do focus on the soil and the plant, equal focus. We have to have a focus on what is underground below our feet, that biological community that is central to natural cycling of plant nutrients. We are going to adopt integrated cultural practices. We're going to talk about aeration and levels of compaction and using grass seed to fill bare spots before weeds develop. We're going to move away from just putting down herbicides, killing a weed and leaving a bare spot. We're going to solve that problem with grass seed. We're going to look to remove salt-based fertilizers. What land management is not a product swap. We are not focused only on product. In the systems-based approach, the product is actually the third part of the equation. Soil biological life first, cultural practices second, and product a distant third. We do use product, certainly, but we don't have that as our sole focus. It is not more labor intensive. If any property has been managed conventionally with a reasonable conventional program and a reasonable natural program is put in its place, we do not expect it to be more labor intensive. And because we can reduce inputs over time, we are looking for a cost savings over time. With conventional products and inflation, prices always going up. If we can begin a natural program, and then, as I said, at the 3-year point, begin to reduce inputs, we're going to have a declining cost over time. In addition to out-of-pocket cost declining, if it is a site that is irrigated, we would be expecting to be able to significantly reduce water as an input into the system at that same period of time. Is it more difficult? One of the things I hear all the time is that it's way too complicated. It's more difficult. It's just too hard to understand. Well, in reality, any of us that are managing turf grass conventionally have had some type of turf and landscape training. We may have gone to school. We may have taken extension courses. We may have attended seminars, but at some point, we have some type of a background or training in what we are doing when using pesticides and synthetics. But that same holds true for organic land care. Training is important. We have to be educated in new practices and protocols. We simply can't, or natural management is not simply getting a piece of paper and following directions. It's beginning to understand a little bit about how a natural system works. So with all of us involved today in this webinar, we are prepared to bring the educational opportunity to the table. We fully prepared to hold hands, to guide, to put in the right direction and develop programs and practices that will work. We'll talk a little bit about that, what that might look like. But once understood, it is certainly not more difficult than a conventional program. So do we expect the park or playing field to get worse before it gets better? You're seeing a municipal picture here. This is after 1 year in East Grand Rapids, Michigan, of stopping all synthetics and moving into an all natural program. And at the end of the first year, they were thrilled because it actually looks more vibrant. This was at the end of 2020, and it looks more vibrant, and it says a deep color, at that point in the season. So the short answer is we do not expect things to get worse before they get better. 20 years ago, that may have been the case because it does take some time to make through this transition. But with what we know now and the science behind it and the science behind product development, we've never had a project yet that actually gets worse before it gets better. So if it's done properly, we have that strong focus both above and below the ground. We move into a period of transition where success follows. Weeds and turf. If there've been selective herbicides applied in the past, there shouldn't be much weed pressure when beginning a transitional program. If we haven't been using a lot of herbicides, then we might be looking at a lot of weeds. What you're seeing is a picture here in Chicago at the beginning of a transition project. So this is the Great Lawn of the Field Museum, and that is going to begin to undergo, or is begun, a 3-year transitional program to move away from synthetic applications. This is the way the field or the lawn was delivered to us, and we expect to make improvements over time. Oftentimes the herbicides are only getting 65–75% control. We hear that all the time, that we've been using herbicides, but we are not killing all the weeds and they all come back and we have to use it again. Our approach is to be proactive with fertility, soil health, grass seed, good cultural practices to manage weeds in turf over time. There is a period called transition. You're seeing here an athletic complex that is also undergoing transition. When natural management programs be put into place after conventional intensive management, there's a window of time. And that's the time when we have to work and make these changes. It does not happen in 1 year. We shouldn't expect it to happen in 1 year. Very often, the first year can be spent simply adjusting soils and getting things in place. We're going to talk a little bit about that and how that happens and why we do that. So when we refer to transition, we're generally talking about a 3-year period. Now, that being said, you saw those pictures from East Grand Rapids, and that transition's moving quicker than most of us expected. We really didn't expect to see such an outstanding result after the first year, and sometimes that does happen. But more typically, we are in a little bit longer period of time. And that time's determined on how that property is given over to transition. As I mentioned, if there has been a diet of pre and post emergence herbicides, we expect very little annual weed grass pressure or perennial broadleaf weed pressure. If not a lot has been done, then we're expecting to see more non-grass species involved in that area. So we can predict the length of time for a transition depending upon specific factors like turf density and weed populations and soil tests when we initially begin the project. The most important element, I can't stress again how important it is, the attention to the soil. And not just the texture, the sand, silt, and clay, or the chemistry of the soil, but the biological fraction of the soil is central. We set expectations. On the left is a AA baseball field, affiliate of the Toronto Blue Jays, that I've been working on for 2 years. And this has been chemical free for both fertilizers and any control products for that time. On the right is a municipal playing field, a local municipality, their baseball field that doubles as field hockey and multi-purpose field. And there's an expectation for that. Obviously, these aren't the same. On the right, you'll find clover in there. Clover has been there for 75 years, so it's never been a mandated issue to get rid of it, but you don't see broadleaf weed pressures there. So there's an expectation on the right and there's an expectation on the left. So expectations can be low, medium, or high. And with any city park district, we generally find that where we have the top tier and then the middle and then lower tiers of management levels on properties, and maybe greater weed presence is allowed at the lower expectations that would not be at the higher. Cultural intensity is a term that describes everything that goes into management, from the product, the labor, and the water, if it's an irrigated site. Everything that's required to meet these different levels of expectations. Low expectations aren't bad. High expectations aren't always good. It rarely is the appropriate expectation for the site. One thing that's true in either chemical or natural management is that a higher level of expectations needs to have a higher level of product input, and there is a cost associated with that. A lower level of expectations generally means lower cultural intensity or lower input, and that translates to a lower cost. It's really not, it's not going to happen to have high expectations and low input and low cultural intensity. So we really have to be objective and honest with assessments and then determine how, and that's how we develop cost per acre. There's a much greater cost per acre on the field on the left than there is on the field on the right. The field on the right, by the way, has been chemical free for 19 years. So that's what it looks like over time when you follow this approach with aeration and grass seed and fertilizer. It is an irrigated field, so we have, that going for us. But this field has improved over time. Conventional versus natural management. Conventional is all of these things here: synthetic fertilizers, chemical pesticides. It's a quick fix. It is a product-centric approach. It involves often the prophylactic use of pesticides, treats symptoms. An insect, a weed, or a disease is a symptom. If we have crabgrass in a park or in a playing field, crabgrass is not the problem. Crabgrass is the symptom. It's a symptom of an underlying problem. And the problem is a bare spot the size of a silver dollar or greater, heavily compacted soil, soil chemistry out of balance, not enough turf density. All of those are underlying problems. And if we systematically adjust the soils to meet the needs and then bring in the cultural practices, we don't have to treat the symptom anymore. We can move over to the natural side of management where we are solving the problem. So the grass seed and the aeration and increasing turf density and adjusting fertility is all problem-solving strategy. Once we solve the problem, there is no need to treat the symptom. And that's what pre-emergent crabgrass control products do. They treat a symptom. Every single year, you have to put down that material. If you stop using that material because you can't use grass seed with pre-emergent crabgrass control, if you stop using that and move into grass seed in a couple of years, you're going to solve the crabgrass problem and it simply goes away. We are choosing product based on sustained benefit. We test soils as the primary basis for all of our inputs, and we're using natural, organic, compliant product. Down below, you'll see some graphics that I got from Penn State years ago, where the conventional view of soil had chemistry, texture, and biology as all three separate areas, unrelated to each other. They proposed that an emerging view of soil health is an integration of those three aspects of soils. And when we get it right on all three, we begin to have a healthy, biologically active soil. Basics of soil. These are the kinds of things that when we give an advanced training and we have some advanced educational opportunities, we will go into each one of these areas. Soil structure, how the soil comes together and how everything functions within it. Pore space, the air pockets that have oxygen for microbes and roots. Horizons, what is down there at 3 inches, 5 inches, 6 inches. Water movement, how does water move through soils? Anaerobic, do we have enough oxygen in the soil? Or is it so heavily compacted that the oxygen is lost and anaerobic conditions begin? And in anaerobic conditions, alcohols are produced and alcohol dissolves the root of the grass. So it's this vicious cycle. And then biological life. In a training, we will talk extensively about how that functions, and not a high-level science course, but just an understanding of what is happening and the interrelationships. So our first process begins with soil testing. It's the basis for all of our inputs. We really shouldn't be just opening bags and putting things down if we don't know specifically if they need to be there. So soil testing, we're going to go to 7 or 8, 9, 10 random spots around the turf area and collect soil. We're looking to fill a 1 gallon sized baggie with soil and maybe some plant parts and roots. And we're going to take it back and we're going to let it sit out on a paper plate or 2 and let it dry out overnight. And we're going to submit it for 3 different samples. Nutrient analysis or soil chemistry gives us some specific information. The gradation analysis, which is also known as soil texture or particle size analysis, and then the soil biological analysis. So we have different laboratories that we go to for these different tests, and these will give us a snapshot in time on what is exactly going on underground. The soil goes under a microscope and specific organisms are identified, and then we learn how to manage them and stimulate them. Just one slide here to just emphasize one more time that all of these statements, nutrients are held, water's retained, maintaining soil structure, no functional place for disease, eggs of many insect pests become a food source for biological life, nutrients are cycled at the correct rate that the plant needs. The microbial life in the soil, the bacteria, the fungi, the protozoa, they are doing all of this for us. So it is of utmost importance that we understand how this is happening. And many times the key input to a program that I might develop may be simply a humate, humic acid, a granular humate, something like biochar, carbon sources that feed the microbes. So instead of focusing all the time on nitrogen, nitrogen, nitrogen for the grass, we focus on building the microbes. Just very quickly here to understand that we look at what we have in the soil from the inorganic, the organic, and the biological fractions. And we identify all that in soil testing, and then the management input is what we have to go out and buy. So we only buy what we need. Fertilizers can be broken down into these 3 distinct areas: organic, organic-based, and synthetic. Natural organic, everything is made up with minerals, plants, or animal byproducts. Organic-based might be some of the above, and then usually the addition of biosolid, which is a sewage sludge compost or urea. Biosolids are not organic compatible. So when we use compost in our natural programs, we are using naturally windrowed or static pile compost. And then we have synthetic fertilizers that are the result of the Haber-Bosch process, or they can simply be acid reacted before they go into the bag to become highly water soluble as soon as they hit the landscape. We have to understand that photosynthesis is really where plant food is made. There is no food for any plant in a bag of fertilizer, and we have been taught that. We now understand that that process of photosynthesis, where the energy from the sun reacts with the green chlorophyll in the blade of grass or the leaf of a tree, and microscopic openings on the leaves, and carbon dioxide goes right inside and reacts and produces carbohydrate, an amino acid. and that is plant food. So the plant makes its own own food in this process. So our strategies enhance this process so that we can make it function at its maximum. A very interesting thing to think about here when we're talking about carbon sequestration. As I just mentioned, carbohydrate is part of the food sources that are made during this process. And 80% of those carbohydrates, more or less, go into the root system. And about half of that is an exudate that goes out into the soil, feeds microbes, and now can be sequestered as soluble organic carbon in the soil. So we're literally scrubbing carbon out of the atmosphere and sequestering it in the soil through this process. We're beginning to think beyond NPK. We're thinking that less is more. We're focusing on the biomass. Nutrient cycling is when one organism consumes the other, and the byproduct is a nutrient release. In this case, for grass, we would specifically focus on ammonium and nitrate nitrogen. With regular high rates of synthetic fertilizer inputs, microbes simply get lazy and don't work efficiently. So we're putting things in at lower doses, lower than generally the recommended rates. We don't go at 1 pound of N, 1,000 square feet an application. We drop down to 3/4 because we don't need as much and it functions better that way. Conventional fertilizers are all of these things, generally water soluble, but can become slow release by either coating or reacting with other chemicals. This is the fast grain up, multiple applications. Used to be inexpensive, but it follows the petroleum market. So big cost increases over the last 10 or 15 years. Probably the big message here is it's directly feeding the plant. It gets in and starts to work in 48 hours. Maximum nitrogen release of a soluble product is 7 to 10 days after application, and 4 to 6 weeks later, it is all gone. So quick in, quick out. Production consumes fossil fuel, releases greenhouse gas, disturbs the soil ecosystem. Generally, the nitrogen and phosphorus, potassium are salts that make up this product. These products upsets the balance of the soil, and as I just showed you the previous slide, it leaches. So all of these are reasons why we're going to think about moving beyond synthetic. Natural organic fertilizers feed the microbes. Over on the right, you see feed the soil. It is the microbes that break this down, the bacteria. It gets in their bodies. A protozoa comes along and eats the bacteria, and the ammonium is released in a plant available form. Other microbes pick up the ammonium and convert it to nitrate, and that's ready. No leaching because it happens day by day, little by little. So this is long-term benefit, measured growth, and cost-effective. Compaction, absolutely the biggest enemy of turfgrass. You can see a field up there. Again, one that we put into transition. It's tough. We had that field turned around in a little over a year, but they took the aerator and they went and punched it all up multiple times. It was organic fertilizer. It involved humates. It was a rugby pitch. In addition to a neighborhood park. And we were able to return that to grass. So at the end of this 2021 rugby season, we no longer had a bare spot. We still had turf cover, and we will build on that for next year. With heavy use of traffic, air particles are squeezed out. I mentioned that pore space, pockets of air, oxygen. When oxygen is lost, the system declines. So aeration is the practice of introducing oxygen back into the turf. It's not just loosening the soils, but it's loosening or fracturing or putting a core hole there so that oxygen can get in. Here we have field use 7 days a week, 7 or 8 hours a day. And you can see the clover in the back of the soccer net. So the herbicides have been used here, but they didn't really solve any problems. They treated a symptom. There's the problem. We have to work on that. So that can be done. We can turn that around. So compaction equals starvation, dehydration, suffocation. There's just a little bit of the science that happens from compaction. And no matter what we do, we can spend all the money in the world on herbicides, water, fertilizer, grass seed. None of it is going to have a lasting effect until we reverse the underlying problem. Jay and I have worked on programs where all we recommended was aeration and humate, carbon to feed the microbes and aeration, because there wasn't a budget to buy nitrogen. And it made a difference. It's those simple practices. So compaction, big focus for us. Here's a picture. This is that great lawn at the Field Museum in Chicago. And this is a project where we're starting. This is going to be a big one, but education. We are going to be in the process. COVID interrupted our site visits to get this project underway, but we did get it underway. This kind of turf management, landscape management, we need the proper education. I can't stress enough. It's simply a reorientation of our thought process regarding land management. As you saw in my introduction, I was conventionally trained. I was taught in the early 1970s that I couldn't manage my agricultural business, my horticultural business, without a strong dependence upon synthetics of all kinds. And I did that for a long time. And I had that fully ingrained in my mind that that's what I had to do. In my own situation, the reorientation of my thought process sort of came naturally because I was using all this stuff and I was using all this PPE, personal protective equipment, and all this, but nothing was ever changing. So I opened my thought process to looking at natural strategies. And as I mentioned, I've spent the last 25 years developing those strategies that work outside in the landscape. High profile turfgrass, public parks, athletic fields is a lot of my focus, but it is any spaces outside where particularly children play or people congregate. And with all of us, it's a willingness to try a different approach. I resisted for a long time. When I had that enlightened moment, everything, land management got so much easier. So over the winter, spring, we'll be putting together a series of online educational opportunities to begin to introduce these concepts and try to avoid, what I call a fear of failure. So we're looking to work hand in hand to develop a natural turf pilot project. Fear of failure is there. And I can remember when the first time I took on 20 acres of public space. And I said that I told the community that I could make, this is 20 years ago, that I could make this organic and I could make it better. And, there was a time when I sat there and said, boy, what happens if I fail? And it just have to have the confidence that many of us have done this. We've been in this direction and we have it now, so that fear of failure should be able to be taken off the table. We have things in place to teach, work through potential concerns. I fully understand skepticism, but explaining that and giving it a chance, we work through the unknowns. And as I said, it can involve things from program development, site visits, educational opportunities, program development, working to integrate through budget, and work to come up with alternatives in New York City that meet the spirit of the legislation and produce healthy, viable public spaces free of synthetics for not just children, but for the public to, to enjoy. And understanding, we hear all the time that it's not just, about the danger of pesticides and, well, I've never seen anybody get sick and I've never known anybody that dies. But the reality that people that use public parks and public spaces, and here's one here, it's not a high profile athletic field, it's just a public gathering space, but people deserve the right and the ability to enjoy nice spaces without low dose exposures to any one of a number of things that may not affect you or me or the person sitting next to us, but it might affect someone else because we're all different. So organic land management strategies work. You can have the confidence that they work, and we are all here to support and help people through this. So with that, Doug, let me turn things back to you.
Okay, Chip. Well, thank you for that overview. That was great. We did have a couple of questions that I noted as you were talking. One was, can you talk a little bit about making our own compost and also the use of compost tea in a municipal setting like that?
Sure. Great question. I think the hard thing for me in a short presentation like this is to touch on all the things to get it into a time frame. But compost and compost tea, very central to what we're doing now in land management and how we're how we're looking at it. Making our own compost is a great thing. There's a process. That's something that if there's enough interest, we can include in an educational opportunity, how to do that, how to properly determine the carbon to nitrogen ratios, and to produce something that is compatible as a replacement for fertilizers in land management, as a replacement for mulches. Compost tea, which is a liquid extract of a high-grade compost, is a compost by definition gives you organic matter. It gives you biological life, and it gives you some retained nutrients. Compost tea gives you the biological life, not much for nutrient and no organic matter. But whether we're making a 2 or 3 hour extraction or a 24-hour brew, the ability to spray compost tea will take the place of a fertilizer application, because what we're doing is stimulating that biological life and getting more protozoa to consume more bacteria to internally produce more nitrogen. We could get, I work with fields right now that can produce less than 25 or 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre over a 90-day period. When we bring compost and compost teas and organics into it, we're striving to make that produce 150 to 200 pounds of nitrogen. So when we can do that much, we cut down on product, and compost tea is a valuable tool for that.
Have you seen anybody, any municipal people make a mistake when they start to do their own compost? I mean, what are the pitfalls to watch out for? What should you make sure you're not doing? I mean, it can't just be, collect all the organic material and throw it into a pile and hope for the best.
Yeah, no, that's very true. Compost by definition should be between 35 and 50% organic matter. The core of that compost pile should reach 137 to 150 degrees for 72 consecutive hours. Then you turn it in. It has to have oxygen in there. It has to be aerobic. So the success is determined by how you begin. And we know that we want to begin with 20 to 1 or 30 to 1 parts carbon to nitrogen. So carbon are the brown things, nitrogen are green things. So it's getting that part of the recipe right. In a municipal composting situation, a lot of times it's all just thrown in a pile, and there's mostly leaves and a little bit of grass. And you generally get a compost that is lower in organic matter. It's usually around 20 to 25%. It usually has 0.7, 0.6% nitrogen, where a properly made one should have 1.8% nitrogen. Moisture content, regulating that. So the beginning of it is what you put in the pile. And if you're really serious about making compost, then you are looking to get the right percentage of browns versus greens. And you should be able to make a good compost in 11 or 12 months.
Do you need to keep it protected from the weather?
Only in excessive periods of rain. So we do have compost covers or tarps that we put on there, generally no, because we want moisture in there. It's all bacterial and biofungal, microbial dominance in there is what's making it happen. So that needs moisture. If we have a really dry material and a dry spell, oftentimes we have to put a sprinkler on it and wet it. So no, we want to leave it open to the elements unless we're in big period of heavy rain, because what that'll do is get in there and cool it down and stop the biological action.
And just about the compost tea, I know, I remember talking about this, and you were telling that there's, the recipe for the tea determines whether it's better for, for trees or it's better for turf, because trees and things like that want a certain, ratio of biological mix, whereas the turf wants something else.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Trees and that type of plant material want to be fungally dominant. And grass actually has a slight bacterial dominance, almost equal fungal to bacterial, but a bacterial dominance. So when we make a compost tea, depending upon the compost that we use, we can make either a bacterial tea or a fungal tea or a balanced tea. So when we are managing at a natural level, and say in the beginning of a pilot project, we would do a biological soil test. And with that test, we get a lot of information, but one of them is the fungal to bacterial ratio of that soil. So if we have a soil that is very strongly bacterial, and we did this in Great Neck, on Long Island in the Park District, we transitioned those parks there, and we had really high bacterial dominance, like almost all bacterial. So in that case, we needed a fungal tea, and they got their own brewer and sprayer and all that. So we'd used a fungal compost to get a fungal tea to improve the fungal percentage in that soil. If we had a soil that had an extremely high fungal dominance, and we were trying to grow turfgrass, then we would want to source out a bacterial tea. We might use vermicompost, worm castings, because they tend to have a little more of a bacterial dominance, and is trying to bring those ratios. If we have trees that are struggling, we do a soil test. We find out what is happening in the soil, and then we would make a tea specifically to address the deficiencies.
We've had a question come in on the chat. How do you apply this to large-scale forest reclamation restoration projects? I guess we're talking about the overall kind of approach. I know, reclamation is a big issue, around here, and probably other places where we got invasive species just, wreaking havoc.
It still comes back to, understanding the soil and a little bit of testing. I was at a meeting 2 weeks ago at a major East Coast city, talking about this same issue, and natural in response to some legislation, and they were talking about the same thing: reforestation, replanting, and the question was asked about soil testing. I wasn't at this meeting, but I got the video of it, and the answer was, we don't bother to soil test. We just plant the tree, and if it grows, it grows. And, that is sort of not the recipe for success. So it's a really inexpensive way. I mean, if we're trying to do restoration and we understand that 95% of the plants on the planet can have a mycorrhizal colonization, then we look at the plant and we determine what type of mycorrhizae wants to be associated with that plant. And at the time of planting, we do an inoculation. The idea is that we're giving that plant all the chances for success to get, to do what it's trying to do, replace where invasives have been mitigated, and establishing a more desirable vegetation.
Yeah, it's all about growing things instead of killing things, right? I mean,
it's all about that. It was, instead of widespread going out and focusing on killing or taking something out, it's really now focusing on, repopulation with the desirable. I think back to when I'm talking about, reclamation like this, a friend of Jay's and mine is a professional goat herder out west. And she works on reclaiming oil lands with goat and vegetation mitigation through goats on a very large scale. And between the hoofing and loosening and the urine and and the manure, and then native grass seed. And 3 years later, you would never believe that these were full of invasives and have been done. Now, I'm saying we're not going to take goats everywhere in New York, but the idea is that if you have a strategy for, to come in and, you're treating the symptom, but now you're going to try to solve the long-term problem. And there's lots of different ways that can happen.
Seems like there's almost always a natural solution. If you look hard enough, you'll find it, right?
That's exactly right. And then an alternative practice or product or just strategy, it's usually always there. If you really try to think, open yourself to thinking a little bit out of the box. We've been trained conventionally and we're in this little box, and begin to think a little bit outside of it.
I remember you in one lecture, you were talking about the way that turfgrass is considered an invasive when you're trying to grow dandelions, greens, and they actually spray to try to get rid of the turf grass because they're trying to get the dandelion greens. And of course, on suburban ones, we do the exact opposite. But I think your point was that in a properly managed soil, grass plants are really strong, and give them a chance and they'll outcompete weeds.
Yeah, turf grass is a thug. And, there's just no, I'm doing a project in Southern California where the turf grass has escaped the lawn and is taken over all the garden beds, and they can't stop it. It's that strong and that aggressive. And, here in the Northeast, we also have strong grasses that if given the right chance and the right strategy, they will outcompete. I mean, I tell the story that I started an athletic field almost 20 years ago, and it was 35–40% covered with broadleaf plantain. 14 or 15 months, no herbicides, aeration, changing practices, organic fertilizer, a compost top dress. 14 months, you could not find broadleaf plantain on that field because we simply encouraged the strength of the turf grass and created soil conditions that plantain didn't like, and lots of oxygen, lots of open space, and the plantain was gone and the turf grass took over. So it usually is always an answer.
Yeah, I know that aeration is a super important part of maintaining things naturally, especially in urban parks where we got tremendous foot traffic. How often can you aerate? And what's your is core aeration best? Is a slice aerator best? What kind of equipment do you recommend for municipalities who have heavy foot traffic?
So expectations are directly tied to how much we aerate. We've actually done sort of developed a metric that so many hours of use on an athletic field causes this kind of compaction and this kind of wear and tear. And then what does it take to recover that to where it was? What does it take to let it decline and slowly get worse? Or what does it take to really make a big improvement? So we schedule aeration when we're looking at some of the higher profile properties and this public park type of thing and playing fields. We can be aerating 4 or 5 times a year for a heavy use field. But then again, it depends on what the use is. So if it's a baseball field or a softball field where the outfield gets much more moderate wear and tear, we probably only have to aerate twice. So it is based on the level of use and how much we want to counter it. Remembering that when we aerate, the benefit lasts for 3 to 5 weeks. And it really is introducing oxygen. And then the wear and tear compacts it back again. We could core aerate, where we have a machine that pulls a core out, leaves it on the surface, and leaves an open channel. We have shatter tine aeration that has tines that vibrate and fractures the soil. We have slice aeration that you mentioned that cuts deep slices in the soil. All of these work. A lot of times, if we're fortunate to have multiple pieces of equipment, we alternate, and we will alternate between the 2 least expensive pieces of equipment are shatter tine and core aeration, and going back and forth. Core aeration works wonderfully when the soil is moist. Shatter tine works when it's a little drier, maybe a non-irrigated site. So the goal of that is to get enough oxygen in, because if we take grass seed and put grass seed on a compacted field, it will germinate, because you can put grass seed on the sidewalk and water it and get some sun and you'll grow grass. It just will never become permanent. Same thing on a compacted field. So we have to relieve the compaction before we can expect the grass seed to take hold and do its job.
So putting down grass seed before you've aerated on a compacted field is really just a waste of money.
It's a total waste of money. Even in my own community, we had a softball field where all the sidelines were totally compacted and big bare spots. And people went out and spread grass seed, and then it got windy. And then 2 days later, there was no grass seed left anywhere. And that was expensive Kentucky bluegrass seed. So had that been aerated, had that been, disrupted, and the seed was allowed to settle in there, that wouldn't have happened. So with good oxygen and good pore space, the grass seeds that we choose, we can get ones that germinate in 5 to 8 days, up to 15 to 20 days. But the idea is that it all happens more efficiently when you have the right soil, to put it on, which is an aerated or compacted relief soil.
So once you've got your field or your space aerated, a can of grass seed is your cheapest and best friend if you want to grow grass, right? I mean, we're constantly overseeding with new life coming into the field.
Yeah, a good friend of mine, Paul Sachs, who owns North Country Organics, had a quote in his Managing Healthy Sports Fields that it likened grass seed to an injection of youth into a naturally aging system. People don't realize that grass plants only live for a year or 2 years maximum, and then they die, and a new grass plant takes its place. So that is with the sideways reproduction of grass, always growing a new tiller or a new rhizome out and up, out and up. So all the grass plants that you see in your lawn now, in 2 years, they're all going to be dead, but they'll all be the next generation that will be there. So when we're using fertilizer, any kind of fertilizer, the most important thing from my perspective is to get the grass to grow sideways. I don't care about the top. I don't care about the color green. I want the roots and I want the sideways. Now, if we introduce new seed into that aging process, now on some fields, like I said, baseball or softball, we may only have to do that for a couple of years. And then we just focus on growing the plants that we have there. If we have a soccer field or a football field that gets lacrosse is really tough, then we have to regularly seed. And all my athletic programs, I'm seeding at least once a year, and on tough ones, some in the spring and then some again later on in the season.
As those grass plants die, they become food for the biomass if you've got an active biomass. If you don't, they become thatch. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
You can write the book.
I
That's
got
exactly what happens. Yeah.
The old brain is still working. Let's talk about irrigation for a moment for fields that have automated sprinkler systems and things like that. There are some parks that have that. Talk a little bit about the issues with irrigation and what to watch for and why you want to be careful about irrigation.
Sure. I think one of the most common practices or problems that we see with irrigated fields is people put too much water out there. Grass is not water dependent. In order to continue it in active growth, yes, it needs moisture. It doesn't need lots of water. And I think that's one of the things that happens. I call it killing the grass with kindness, because people tend to think that water equals kindness. So can we grow it without water? Yes, we can. Will it maybe go dormant in the summer if it's dry and hot and doesn't rain? Yes, it might. And that's not the end of the world, because that's the way the grass protects itself. But on an irrigated field, our goal is to keep it green throughout the growing season, keep it actively growing throughout the growing season, but not trying to push it with excessive introductions of water. So typically, in the New York region, we would be looking at 1 inch of water a week should be sufficient. in May and June. It could probably be delivered with a ½ an inch of water twice a week, and that should be fine. Once we move towards the end of June through Labor Day, we might increase it to 3 times a week. And we might, pop up to 1.5 inches of water, maybe 2 inches at the max. After that, we're introducing enough water that could potentially cause problems in the turf, keeping the soil too soft, potentially allowing for fungal pathogens to come in. And just like drought or dryness slows down the growth of grass, excess water slows it down, because all those air pockets that I talked about are now full of water all the time. So the idea with watering is you want to introduce enough water to let it carry down 4 inches to the root zone, and then you want to let that dry out. That's what's called field capacity. When you fill all those air pockets with water, and then you allow all that water to drain below the root zone, the moisture that is left is field capacity, where you have the perfect balance between soil moisture and oxygen. When you water too much, you basically have water in those pockets all the time. Oxygen is gone, goes anaerobic, the alcohols start to produce, and the turf declines.
What's the number one problem that or number one mistake that you've seen over and over in your work with municipalities as they make this transition, away from chemical pesticides and high salt fertilizers? What's the number one mistake? Is it that their expectations are too high? Is it that they do? Well, I'll leave it there. What's the number one problem that you see?
I think the number one problem is embarking on transition and not understanding how a natural approach works versus a chemical. So when you put down a synthetic fertilizer, the results are instant, two days, and you notice the difference. When you put down an organic fertilizer, it may be 7 or 8 or 9 days before the microbes break that down and it goes through all the cycle, and then you get that same result. So you get it in 2 days with synthetics, and you get it in 8 days with organic. So the frustration that it doesn't happen that way. Jay and I are involved in a project where, the first time out of the gate, and put down organic fertilizer, and some weeds developed, and without checking with us, just went for the weed killers, and went and brought back the herbicides to kill all the weeds, which defeated the strategy because that reversed all the gains that we had made in the soil. So I think the number one thing is, problem that people make is that they look at a program, and we've run into this, where we develop a program and then they use the program like a menu of options and say, well, I can do that. That's easy, but I don't really want to do that, or I can't afford to do that, so I'm not going to do that, and I'll only do these things. When in reality, if they couldn't afford something and they slashed out, the humate in favor of the nitrogen, they would have been much better off to slash out half the nitrogen and focus on the humate. So it's understanding how all the different components of because we're trained to open one bag. Unless we have to lime. If the soil's acidic, we need to lime to 6.5 to 7. So a soil test tells us that. But other than that, we're basically opening those bags, and putting that down there, and not really focusing on different aspects, right? So now we've just talked about water. We've talked about aeration. We've talked about grass seed. We've talked about feeding the microbes, and we've talked about nitrogen for the grass. And in order to be successful, it involves a little bit of all of that. And that's probably the biggest mistake, is people focus on only things where their comfort level is. And unfortunately, we're all trained to have the comfort level on the bag of fertilizer. Mm-hmm. But to realize that 2 pounds of granular humate per 1,000 square feet for a cost of $87 an acre should never be eliminated. That should be first and foremost protected in the program. So that's why when we work now, I used to do a lot of consultation and just do, one visit and give them a program and explain it and done, or 1 year and done. Now the engagement is always 3 years, because it's guiding. The biggest concern or the biggest questionable things that could happen is that transition from year 1 to year 2. How do we do what we learned in year 1? How do we take what we learned? We have our original pictures, we have site evaluations, we've got the soil test. Now we look at it and say, okay, here's where we've gotten at the end of year 2. Do we keep the same program in place, or do we tweak it? And do we tweak it to meet a certain need or demand? And that's where the education comes in. And that's where, from my focus, sharing my experience, I've made a lot of mistakes. I've seen a lot of failures. That's probably some of my best learning has come by things that didn't work as expected. So we've been able to modify and tweak and look, so that moving the transition from year 1 to year 2 and year 2 to year 3 is, I think, where, a lot of times, folks might struggle.
This has really been terrific, Chip. I think the information has been great. I want to address our visitors who are here to learn from New York City Parks, and just say to you, the really good news for you is that we are funded by Stonyfield Yogurt. Is that right, Jay? Among others, to allow Chip to be your consultant for your park at no cost to you. So that's quite a remarkable thing. And I just wanted to point out to you who are watching this, this is the first of what we hope will be a long series of webinars that Chip is going to lead. Some of those may be actually not online, but in person, at a park, where it'll be a kind of hands-on demonstration and a learning opportunity. This is all free, and we certainly hope that you will take advantage of it. Certainly if I was managing a park, to have somebody like Chip that I could be in touch with and could learn from on a regular basis, I think I'd probably take advantage of that. So with that, I'm going to yield the floor back to Jay Feldman. And again, thank you, Chip, and thank you to all of the attendees for this program.
Thank you, Doug.
Well, thank you guys, and thank everybody for attending. I think this last part of the discussion really hones in on the value of collaboration here on a project like this, and implementation of a law. A lot of laws are passed, and then they collect dust on the shelf, and you look back years later and you go, well, whatever happened to that law, that we passed? And we're trying to really jump ahead of the curve here and work with you all at the park level. What Chip talked about in terms of the program that he will propose, and it will be on an individual park basis. I mean, we have found a lot of variety, a lot of circumstances that are specific to specific parks, and we need to tease out that information and then formulate plans around your park. They're not all that different often, but there are enough differences that it can make the difference between success and failure. The key thing here, and I really don't want anybody to be scared off by this, is really what Rachel Carson wrote about in Silent Spring. And she said, we live with complex biological communities. And part of what Chip is describing when he talks about humates and organic fertilizer and aeration is the recognition that every park has a complex biological community that we're walking on and we're playing on. And what Chip is doing with this program is evaluating what that complex biological community in the soil needs to work for you. In agriculture, we talk about this as ecosystem services. The soil and the microbial life is a service in cycling nutrients, in providing the nutrition that the plant material needs to thrive. And so, as Doug said, we understand there's a transition, and we raise the funds through Stonyfield Organic and other supporters to work with New York City specifically to help make this program a success. It will start with soil testing, not just of texture and soil chemistry, but the soil food web that Chip talked about. Get that information, go over it with you all, look at it, and design the program around that specific information. So this is really exciting. We're really, really excited because not only, has New York been a leader in all kinds of areas, I mean, climate, in terms of recycling, this is a great opportunity to link all these programs together and basically have a result that everybody's proud of throughout the city and among the visitors to the city. So, Doug, I guess that's sort of my wrap up in terms of this program today. Again, we're looking at this as a jumping off point, as a beginning point, not an end point. This was an overview, an introduction to the concepts that Chip and Osborne Organics is talking about. Reach out to us. Let's start this conversation. We want to hear from you directly. We'd love your feedback, your thoughts, where you see challenges, where you see opportunities. And again, thank you so much for being here today. We're thrilled to have the level of participation we had today, and we look forward to moving forward. Thank you all. We'll be in touch soon.